Hello, and you are listening to EcoJustice Radio, a project of SoCal 350 Climate Action. Our show presents environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on traditional, mainstream, or even public media outlets. Welcome. I am Jessica Aldridge. On today's show, Ecological Succession, Moving Toward Regeneration, host Carrie Kim interviews Linda Gibbs. Linda Gibbs is owner and principal land manager of The Gardens at the world-famous Woodshed recording studio in Malibu. Linda's depth of knowledge and experience in using the 6 regenerative soil principles is applied to her practice and teaching of permaculture, biodynamics, and the wise woman tradition of healing. She is an ardent soil advocate for Kiss the Ground, a founding member of the grassroots soil restoration group Soil Sponge Collective, and a former teacher of the Gaia School of Healing in California. She serves as a presenter and speaker on ecosystem restoration and offers a weekly Zoom Q&A on soil. Her home burned down in the Woolsey Fire of 2018. However, the gardens and studio survived. Following this event, Linda dedicated herself to teaching others about fire resilience in ecosystems and buildings and how Woodshed Gardens and Woodshed Recording Studio remain a green oasis due to the soil carbon sponge. We are losing the world's topsoil at an alarming rate of 30 football fields of soil per minute, which can largely be attributed to modern farming practices and the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Widespread deforestation is also a factor. Continuing soil degradation at current rates will further worsen climate change and exhaust our global capacity to grow food for the world's burgeoning 7 billion plus population. This episode explores ecological succession as a means to foster our deeper understanding of the cycle of and purpose behind regenerating soil. Thank you for tuning in to Ecological Succession, Moving Toward Regeneration, with host Carrie Kim and guest Linda Gibbs.
Aloha, this is Carrie Kim, and you're listening to EcoJustice Radio. Listeners, today we'll explore ecological succession to understand the cycle and purpose behind regenerating the soil. Given the state of our planet, understanding succession can aid us in becoming more attuned and aware stewards and participants in restoring ecosystems, increasing biodiversity, balancing the hydrological cycle, and feeding the soil food web. Today, we're grateful to have on the show Linda Gibbs of Woodshed Gardens and the Soil Sponge Collective. So welcome, Linda.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We have hounded you for months to come on the show to speak succession. And finally, here we are. We've roped you in.
I'm so happy to be here.
We're thrilled to have you back on the show to speak more soil wisdom to all of us. And we wanted to thank and honor the Tongva ancestors as our show takes place on Tongva lands. We want to honor them first and foremost. So, Linda, can you start at the beginning and explain for our listeners the what and the why of ecological succession? What is it, and why do we need to care about it now?
Great. So, ecological succession is basically the history of and the trajectory of all ecosystems on the planet. So you start, if you think of a starting point on the history of soil, you have water and rock, right? And you get this fungi that comes up onto the rock and makes a symbiotic relationship with some blue-green algae and forms lichen.
Mm-hmm.
And you begin this process of having soil. So you move from there. Think about that as a starting point, which on land at the beginning doesn't have a very high carrying capacity, meaning how much
Right.
life can it support.
We're
And then
thinking bare rock, yes? Kind of at the bare rock stage?
yeah, the bare rock, the ocean, and some soil, some lichen, the old growth forest, right? That would be your endpoint. And so succession is moving from that bare rock to the old growth forest, or moving back in succession from the old growth forest
Back to bare rock?
back to the bare rock, or we're really good at bringing them back to deserts, right?
Okay.
So the Sahara used to be a forest. A lot of the Middle East was a verdant garden. So those are, they made their apex and their succession, and then they moved backwards, right? So why we should care about this is because it helps, once we understand that there is this succession, that nature is constantly moving towards a forest, we can begin to understand why, or understand how it got to where it is. Also, because we care so much about our gardens, or we care about growing food, understanding that succession and how to get it to where it is in in that succession that is helpful for growing the food or creating the ecosystem that we want, we can help it along without the use of herbicides and pesticides.
Can you explain what you mean when you say help it along? So would you be meaning the biomimicry and various ways that we could, as you said, sort of, I guess, accelerate succession, or again, like you said, move it along? So
you're giving it a jump start. So say let's take my property. So the Woolsey fire came by, and in that area of the untended gully, we had treetops, and we had brush and vines and all sorts of stuff growing. If the fire had come through and just burnt the ground, and just like the dead brown, the dead stuff, it wouldn't have set the succession back very far. It would have recuperated quite quickly. However, it burnt all the way to the treetops, and the trees, everything, the bushes, the shrubs, the vines, the treetops, the canopies, everything gone, completely gone. That sets back the succession very far.
The disturbance, you mean, sets back the succession? Like the degree of the disturbance?
Correct. Thank you. We're talking the fire, we're talking about a disturbance. Exactly. And so why, if everything is trying to get to a forest, why isn't everything getting to a forest?
So there's always a disturbance, isn't it? Is disturbance sort of the natural state of things, that there's always going to be some level of disturbance, and it's a matter of what kind of scale that disturbance is at?
Right, exactly. Right. So nature has disturbances like floods and fires and hurricanes, or even the bison on the plains. If you think of them as, 15 miles long and 5 miles wide, that's a huge disturbance, right? So that keeps that area at a grassland rather than moving towards a forest, because you've got that natural disturbance happening, right?
But in that scenario, that's desirable, no?
Yeah, I mean, grasslands are very productive, and a lot of people like deserts too. So, but the plains were some of the richest soil, and I think they called it the breadbasket of America, because it was. But we very quickly turned it into the Dust Bowl, right?
Right.
And that is because of the tilling, which was a disturbance that took the succession back too far, right? It wasn't a small disturbance. It was a huge disturbance that happened over and over and over again.
Could you talk a little bit more about the tilling? Because we know that in a lot of the organic farming, that is still being used as a practice. I know a lot of people will think organic farming is so great, but there's still perhaps this tilling that happens for a lot of organic farmers, and we know that that's actually destructive to the soil. Could you speak a little bit more about the disturbance that tilling presents?
Yeah. So the tilling breaks up any fungi that might be present. It creates a bacterial bloom. So similar to a red tide, where the bacteria is very hungry and it starts eating the carbon organic matter very quickly. So now you have a release of a lot of carbon into the air. You have a release of oxygen into the air because you've broken up those pockets that are naturally aggregated in the soil. And so we began our tillage, at a few inches, and then we went to a few feet, and then we went to more feet. And so we made our compaction go further and further down.
So could you talk about also what compaction is? Again, not all listeners may be gardening or farming, and so some of the may not be familiar. What does that mean? Although I'm sure all of them have compacted soil, especially if they live here in an urban setting.
Great question. So compaction is exactly like you think of it. You're making a cake, and you are told to put a cup of brown sugar, right? Compacted brown sugar. So you could scoop that brown sugar, and it's going to be all clumpy and have lots of air in it, and it's going to take up that whole cup pretty quickly. But if you pound it in and press it down, then all of a sudden your soil has sunk, right? Or your sugar has sunk in the measuring cup. And so now you can add some more, and you press it down. You add some more and you press it down. And now you've got a lot more sugar in that small container than if you had just kind of scooped it. Right? That brown sugar.
Right.
So the same thing with the soil. You have this loss as it goes down because you have no airspace, right? So, and oxygen is important for the essential workers underneath the soil, just as it is important for us.
Right. So they need the space for all the microorganisms to have space to live and thrive and move.
Well, they need the oxygen, right? And they actually will create those air pockets because as they aggregate the sand, silt, and clay together into these clumps instead of this pounded powder, right? That's very close together. Now it's little clods that lay on top of each other and don't fit perfectly. And so now you have all these pore spaces. So now you have a lot of oxygen. And the reason it doesn't fall apart when water hits it, because those microorganisms that are holding them together, what they call soil aggregates, are very sticky. And so they're both hydrophobic and absorbent at the exact same time. Just like a sponge doesn't fall apart, even though it has a lot of holes, it absorbs a lot of water, but it doesn't fall apart. Where that compacted soil, either the water doesn't get through at all, or it completely falls apart.
Right. Well, we know, most people know what is compacted dirt because they've had that experience of you try to dig a shovel into that. It's like digging into concrete. We've experienced a lot of that kind of soil here in the urban setting. And, what is the primary cause of that compaction? That's a sign of degraded soil. But what is really the cause of that compaction?
The loss of the biology. So the loss of the biology is the largest cause, I would say. Of course, heavy traffic can be a huge cause of it, right? although Gabe Brown says he can drive a semi on his soil in the rain and compact.
Right, because it's got so much.
His soil's so perfect.
So fertile and has everything, all that it needs to have.
Well, he has that sponge that goes down very deep. It's not just inches or a foot deep. It's feet deep. Like they've gone 30 feet down, and it's aggregated, and it's full of carbon, and it's incredible.
But in this kind of environment, we're not in grasslands, we're not on farmlands. I mean, what is there some kind of an ideal of how far down we should have a sponge, have a soil carbon sponge, have this kind of healthy soil? Like, how deep do we really need to penetrate?
We need it to be as deep as the aquifers. Okay. So that when it rains, the water can run all the way to the aquifers or to the stone, the granite, so that perennial springs can pop up and we can have running water while we're waiting for the rains to come.
See, I think this is the thing that so fundamentally so many people don't understand exactly the relationship of soil and the hydrological cycle, and why that, we take, for example, California and sort of drought conditions, and people not understanding, well, what's the relationship of drought to degraded soil?
A shorter green growing season that then we have roots that are more and more shallow, and then
water in this poor soil,
and then self-feeding that shorter green season that then has bare soil for a long period of time continually further interrupts that hydrological cycle so that we have less and less rain.
Which we are experiencing right now, right? To have so little rain at this point of the season right now. I think most of us realize that.
And we're in La Nina, but we also have experienced La Ninas too with, more rain.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to diverge just a little bit to the pandemic.
Okay.
It feels that the pandemic is really a perfect example and parallel to succession. I say that our degraded environment is basically ground zero for disease and weakened immunity, just like compacted soil. It's the same to the ecosystem. It's no longer fertile. And, for us, if the pandemic is the disturbance to the ecosystem of ourselves and the planet, what naturally comes next in the arc of succession for us?
I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question, but I can talk about environments in the ecosystem that support disease, right? So a lower succession that is highly bacterial dominant is supports the weeds that outcompete the food, right? The food crops, the so-called cash crops. A anaerobic or acid soil that is, below 5 is going to be the perfect host for those pathogenic organisms. And the degradation of the ecosystem, and the loss of that biology to support the availability of nutrients to the food parallels so that brings down the immunity of the plants, and that parallels our immunity that is falling.
Yeah, the lowered immunity that we experience now with this whole pandemic crisis,
Yeah, and before the pandemic, all the autoimmune diseases, because we don't consciously put together that we are inheriting the immune system, as John Kempf likes to say, we inherit the immune system of the plants that we eat. And if it's being grown in bacterial dominant soils that are compacted and basically just the soil's acting as a placeholder for the roots, and the roots aren't deep, and they're just being fed an IV of a chemical cocktail that is very limited of just nitrogen, phosphorus, and calcium, and missing the rest of the periodic table. We're missing it too.
I'm going to take
our immune system suffering.
We're going to take a break right here, Linda. You can hold that thought, and we will continue in just a second.
You are listening to EcoJustice Radio, a public-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org and socal350.org. We hope you're enjoying this episode, Ecological Succession Moving Toward Regeneration, with host Carrie Kim and guest Linda Gibbs, teacher, owner, and principal land manager of the gardens at the world-famous Woodshed Recording Studio in Malibu.
From there, could you tell us, how does succession apply to human evolution and fostering a regenerative relationship between humanity and nature?
Again, I feel like these are way over my pay grade.
This is a pondering.
Yeah. Repeat the question. Repeat the question. Let me see if I can.
How can succession apply to human evolution and fostering a regenerative relationship between humanity and nature? Because you really are running this parallel. It's like our microbiome, our ecosystems, they are happening at the same time. The ill health of the planet and our ill health, they are reflections of each other. And which came first is the question.
Yeah, the chicken or the egg. The immune system's health or our separation from our connection to the ecosystem. Which one came first?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
We're feeding each other, I guess. But I feel that most of it, just living in the Anthropocene era, that really it is our sort of human negligence, human disconnection from nature. We know the healthiest place for us to be is actually outdoors, but look at us right now. We are, frozen indoors in this kind of state of the pandemic.
Well, one thing that I thought about that made me question, because I'm always comparing things to the soil and the ecosystems and questioning. And when we use fertilizers, and so to feed, these inorganic fertilizers to feed the plants, they become very weak immune-wise. And so they are attacked by pests and disease. They are a target, and they don't have the defense against them. So then we create these pesticides and herbicides to deal with the insects and the fungus disease or the rot disease, the blight, whatever it is. We're creating another chemical to deal with that.
Right.
And it doesn't just stop there. So then nature decides to create super weeds, and we have to create stronger herbicides. They become so weak that they require more of these inorganic fertilizers, so that we end up having to use more and more and more to get usually less and less.
Yeah.
And so when we have a disease of any type, and we're not focusing on what caused it or how to improve our immune system, and we're using antibiotics, and the body in nature creates antibiotic resistant bacteria.
Right.
I wonder, with the increase of immunizations that we are beginning to rely on,
what are we creating?
What is the consequence down the road? What is that going to be?
What's the adaptation that shows up in nature? I mean, I think it's the same thing with, the vaccines, how people are running out for the vaccine. We already see different strains of the virus appearing, and it's like trying to isolate something and attack it, which is really unrealistic when we talk about the presence of virus in the ecosystem, in the land, the air, the water. We live in a field of virus.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I'm not a MD, and everybody has to make their own decisions. I'm just asking, like, where are we going as a species if this is the
route we take,
where the young have way more, the young children today in school have way more immunizations than I was ever exposed to, and more than my children were exposed to.
I wanted to go back to the beginning of the pandemic when no one was driving, the ecosystem was getting restored in ways that we haven't seen in a very long time. You could see blue skies here. And I wonder, that was a watershed moment actually globally. And we could literally see the impact of our lifestyles and also the impact of when humans recede and allow nature to recycle itself. And I was wondering, do you feel that was a golden opportunity for us to really realize the urgency of restoration now?
Well, I mean, yes. I think the pandemic itself was a great opportunity to stop and reflect on where we are. How do we get here? What are we doing? What are we doing wrong? I mean, I felt the same thing with 9/11. It was like for a split second we thought about how did we get here and what did we do to cause that?
Mm-hmm.
And then instead we just went to war, and we're still at war, and it's and we're not doing things differently to change what got us there. So I don't know. We learn slow, I guess.
Well, it feels like technological solutions, for example, the vaccine, they serve as some kind of a surrogate for connecting to ourselves and nature and actually understanding our own biology and the ecology. It's very easy to abdicate that responsibility. And I think we have done that very successfully because I work in the healthcare field and I see how many human beings have completely abdicated the health of their own bodies to a doctor, to medical systems, and they don't even know how their own biology works. As many of us, we don't even know how the ecology works.
Right. Yeah.
So it feels very important for us to get back to that deep learning.
So back to the question of why we should care about what is succession. And, when we have that huge disturbance that sets the succession back, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Elaine teaches to then go and see what's left and grow that biology through, teas and compost. So I'm wondering what would be the equivalent for us to see what's left. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a doctor. You're in the medical field. Maybe you have some ideas.
It's good to contemplate these things, even if we don't have answers. It's good to be asking.
Yeah, be in the question.
This is exactly what the pandemic needs to present: is we need to start questioning what is happening to our air, soil, and water. What is happening to our own health? Why is it that the health of people here on Turtle Island is so incredibly compromised as compared to much of the rest of the world? So these are big questions.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, what is the effect of engaging restoration without having any view to succession? You just start doing restoration, you have no idea where you are in that arc. What is that?
So people apply all sorts of things that might be inappropriate, and so they're just going to die, meaning,
trying to grow a tree in like dead dirt.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's true. It's trying to skip the succession, right?
Trying to grow something when your soil is not ready.
Yeah. So that we haven't even talked about that, how the weeds are these mother crops that nurture the crops that we're trying to grow, either the food crops or the trees,
They're
or
clearing.
even our ornamentals that are much more comfortable in a higher succession. But anytime you have a highly disturbed area, the weeds are the first thing that's going to grow. And you can jumpstart that by introducing that biology.
How would that be? By the living roots or?
Yeah, so living roots like the cover crops that we've done with your Soil Sponge Collective that we do, and the teas. But the best thing is to have is to either know how to use the microscope or have somebody, hire somebody who knows how to use the microscope.
Mm-hmm.
And also know something about the land that you're on and where it was, because we all tend to look back 50 or 100 years and think it needs to be frozen in time just like that.
Mm-hmm.
So here in Malibu, where I am in Point Dume, everybody always loves to point to how there were never trees on Point Dume, and all these eucalyptus trees that everybody planted, are problematic. They're in the way of my view, and they're a fire hazard.
Uh-huh.
And honestly, Point Dume was a wind-swept hell. And the Department of Defense is the one that came along and planted those eucalyptus trees in the 1940s as windbreaks to try to, slow down that dust bowl, basically. I don't believe that it was always a dust bowl. There's just no way. There's no way. And after the fire, all the trees and all the plants that have just volunteered show me a picture of a riparian zone that is very different from this desolate,
right?
That, I think probably had something to do with oak trees being cut down for buildings or, to make fences.
That deforestation was taking it back.
Yeah. And then, cattle and pronghorn sheep and everything else that was put on the land and not managed, holistically or in a biomimicry fashion. And the loss of all the bear that used to be there. I mean, there's a lovely book that shows, bears eating whales in Paradise Cove.
Oh my goodness, I can't believe it.
Yeah, so don't tell me there weren't bears, in Point Dume, if they were on the beach in Paradise Cove. So, when you kill all those animals, it interrupts the ecosystem and the nutrient cycling that keeps that succession moving.
Right, and when you take away the habitat, so what is the difference, would you say, between succession and evolution? Are they synonymous?
Yeah, I guess succession just describes a state of evolution, right? And evolution is maybe that
the whole process.
Yeah, I'm picturing water or a roller coaster for some reason. I don't know why, but so the evolution is the water, the river, and the succession are those different points and curves within the river, right? The river of time.
Stops along the way, yeah. Stops along the way for the river. Well, I think if we understand succession, we can better understand, looking at a desert, that this is not something fixed. This is not a static, frozen environment that will always be like this till the end of time, nor was it. It's a state of where it is, as you said, in the evolution. And that's a constantly changing, it's a continuum.
That's correct.
You can move that desert to forest, and you can move the forest back to desert, and that's happening all the time around the world.
Right. And It's been a little frustrating for me having conversations with those who are tending our state and national parks at times, because they're trying to keep a degraded ecosystem static. And when you suggest compost or something, it's as if you just offered a 2-year-old a vodka martini or something.
Why that reference?
I don't know. These are the images that come in my head. I think because you're maybe that's coming into my head because we are now all of a sudden this early degraded, not that a child is a degraded, but it's a child is an early succession, right? Mm-hmm. And you can introduce biology to jumpstart the succession. And
can you give an example of that so that people, it's not just ecological terms, but they understand more simply what would that look like?
Jumpstarting the biology?
What would be an example of jumpstarting the biology?
So you would look at the soil under the microscope and see what's left there, what kind of microorganisms are there. You would ideally find an area that isn't degraded and see what's there, and try to then, through compost teas, feeding that biology through aeration and water and things like fish hydrolysates and molasses and kelp, things like that. But there are others too that people are experimenting with, and to feed those microbes so that you can multiply them very quickly, right? So what you have to realize is that early succession, you've got bacteria only. Mm-hmm. And then as it moves, you have a lot of bacteria, not just a little bit of bacteria. Now you have a lot of bacteria, but now you're starting to see maybe a little bit of fungi. Mm-hmm. And then you start moving and, and you've got even more bacteria, but now you've got now some fungi. Then now you're getting to where you're even maybe 1-to-1 bacteria to fungi, and then you're moving towards fungal dominant. So but that doesn't mean you don't have bacteria. You have a lot of bacteria, but you have even more fungi.
Okay.
So you need to grow those microorganisms in order, and not just the bacteria and the fungi. You need your nematodes and your protozoa and your microarthropods that are eating the, you need your predators to keep the fungi and the bacteria in balance, just like you need your wolves to keep your packs of deer in balance.
Can you define, we have just like a minute here before we have to take a break, but could you address disturbance and the different levels of disturbance? Because we know there's like small scale disturbance, or there's disturbance that actually leads to and actually promotes succession in a good way.
Right. So again, it's not so much, just like people always want to ask me, like, what is a fireproof plant? And it's like, okay, no such thing. And okay, well, what's fire resilient? And it's not the plant. Mm-hmm. It's the health of the plant, which is based on the health of the soil. And so, what was the question again? Sorry.
Defining disturbance, but let's take
disturbance. Right. So it's not the type of disturbance; it's how much recovery between disturbance.
Okay,
that is much more important than the type of disturbance.
Okay, let's take a break right there, and we will come right back.
You are listening to EcoJustice Radio, a public-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org and socal350.org. We hope you're enjoying this episode, Ecological Succession Moving Toward Regeneration, with host Carrie Kim and guest Linda Gibbs, teacher, owner, and principal land manager of the gardens at the world-famous Woodshed Recording Studio in Malibu.
So, Linda, can you go on a bit more about disturbance? You were saying that it's the time between disturbances, like that recovery phase. If you have a disturbance, but you can recover the soil, it's not a problem versus if you have 3 fires in a row on that same soil.
In a fire,
Mm-hmm.
and in a fire like that came through my property, and there's no trees left, right, in that one area.
Mm-hmm.
The area I was tending, all the trees survived. Same fire. Went right through. If I had another fire go through there in, say, 3 or 4 years, it would be very devastating.
It would take much longer for it to recover.
It's going to take much longer. Those trees need to have time to grow back to some size so that a fire can go through and they won't burn.
I think this is also relevant for people to understand, the rate at which our topsoil is being lost, degraded, eradicated, the fertility of the soil, and how long it takes to actually restore that. And I know with the United Nations, there was this figure of saying that it takes 1,000 years to build 3 centimeters of topsoil. But, I'm sure you would argue that point because it's based on where you are in succession and how much biology you add to that, correct?
Well, also that is based on us not understanding soil. And so we used to look at soil from a chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I would say most universities and most farmers still do. It's this emerging science that is looking at soil not from a chemistry perspective, but from a biological perspective. And when you look at it from a biological perspective,
how much life
you're growing inches a year,
right? Yeah.
Not 1,000 years.
Right.
So, they're just looking at the grinding of the sand, silt, and clay off of the stone, not realizing that biology, the fungi, and some bacteria can break down that rock themselves. Doesn't have to happen from weathering. And again, if you think of that compacted soil and then it getting aggregated, and you have all these pore spaces that are coming into it, it's growing like those skinny little sponges that you buy that are super flat, and you put them in water and they go, right? That's what our soil starts doing. And so, are we really growing it? Or, because in the most think about this. 75% of the weight in the most productive ecosystems, a forest, is fungal biomass.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
75%. That's huge.
It is.
It's not the sand, silt, and the clay.
Right.
So when you realize that it's not just the sand, silt, and the clay, soil can be grown quite quickly.
So why is it that we don't hear more about the fungi, knowing that the fungi are such an imperative component to the ecosystem?
Well, we've done a really good job of destroying it everywhere. It doesn't. So the systems of which we used to test, that we still do, is Petri dishes. And these Petri dishes in the laboratory are not good conditions for these fungal organisms to survive. So they try to grow them in these agar Petri dishes with certain foods that the fungi is just like not going to be there. So you could actually have it and it's not going to show up in these traditional.
The testing is not very accurate, you're saying?
The old testing. We have really good testing now. It's just not very many people are using it yet.
Could you say, does succession always follow this predictable kind of linear order of progression of going from, is it ever diverge from this and happen more holographically versus like step, step, step?
Holographically. Can you give me an example?
I mean, does it ever jump steps? Or, it seems like so kind of linear the way we've described it.
Yeah.
I don't is that because nature is so non-linear? This is my question. So
Yeah. That's yeah. So that's the way we're looking at it because we're pretty linear. Well, I would say, some of the studies that Elaine talks about, where they start Elaining them. She's worked with farmers where at ground zero, everything's tilled, everything's the same. They will plant, they'll spray one part of the field with their herbicides and everything to kill all the weed seeds, to kill all the, any disease, and then they plant, chill, and then they'll have an area where they don't do anything but plant the seeds. And then they'll have kind of also as a buffer between the spraying and not spraying, right? Mm-hmm. Then they'll have an area on the farm where before they plant the seeds, they will do 2 applications of her BioComplete, compost teas, right? Mm-hmm. And extracts, and maybe in applying compost, whatever, but they're getting biology into this tilled, only bacteria soil. Mm-hmm. And then they come back a few, I don't know, a week later. Mm-hmm. And the area that has nothing has a lot of weeds. Her area, almost no weeds.
Can you explain that?
So it's skipping it's skipping that succession of weeds that are going to come in to create that biology and feed, create the soil conditions that'll be good for the cash crop, for the food crop, right?
It skipped that step because you added enough biology that it moved the succession along faster than it
gave it a jump start. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And what's interesting is where they're spraying twice, and then there's less weeds than where they did nothing, but there's still lots of weeds. Mm-hmm. And where she's not sprayed anything, she's only added the biology. The food crop has a much better chance of growing because it's not being shaded out by those weeds that are growing so fast.
I see. Do you anticipate climate change disrupting these patterns of succession?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think
that already, right?
It's already happening. Exactly.
Natural patterns, I guess it's also just things that are getting accelerated. I mean, even with the magnifiers here, right?
Yeah. I mean, the magnifiers are a perfect example because when you have a fire that comes through and burns everything instead of just the floor and and kind of works under the trees, you've gone back in succession a lot.
And then we've also added all the toxicity from the burns, when you have structural burns and all the volatilizing vapors and these gases, these are...
Well, and all the herbicides that we're using are creating the conditions for the weeds that die fast and create the conditions for the fires to start. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these fires are started by the electric companies mm-hmm. under these annual grasses that die, mm-hmm. As soon as it gets hot. And they're the perfect, if you ever done friction fire, mm-hmm. you want to start on, those little grasses. You're not starting on trees and wood, and you're starting on something very small because these fires are being started with a spark from the wires or the transformers.
So talk about from here, the farmlands of the Midwest. If you could explain what's happening regarding succession there and what really should be happening.
Well, we've degraded the land so much with the inorganic fertilizers and the Roundup and
all the chemicals,
the C2D40, whatever, all the huge amount of cocktails that they have. Mm-hmm. So we are losing huge amounts of topsoil. I think, it's been a while since I was focusing on the doom and gloom of,
like 30.
It's like 1 ton per acre per year. I mean, it's a huge amount of topsoil that we are losing. And it's but not only that is we're losing the water in the ground.
Right.
So all this huge amounts of rain are going into the ocean rather than into the aquifers. And so we are not
regenerating the aquifers.
So then what is left in the aquifers? We're draining, and everything's becoming more and more and more arid.
And then we have erosion.
Well, and that's what the topsoil is that when it rains, it takes all this topsoil with it to the ocean. Instead of that effective rainfall is how much, we got 6 inches. How many inches did you get in your soil? Did you get 6 inches? Or did you get a 1/4 inch and the rest ran into the street, down into the drain pipe and into the ocean?
That was another thing we didn't really cover, is how much the soil can capture the rainfall and store it.
The soil will capture and hold way more water than any of our dams and aqueducts and all our man-made things. We just need to get it back in the soil, into the aquifers and into the running springs. And then that is also going to grow green longer, and then we get more rain. Instead of, what are we getting? We're getting global dimming. We're getting precipitation stuck to a lot of pollution particles.
Can you talk, what is global, what did you call it? Global
dimming.
Dimming? I don't know what that means.
Well, I've been really ever since the Thomas fire, it's so apparent to me where I'm living, where I can be driving down PCH and I can't even see the ocean. Because there is so much precipitation in the air stuck to dust and dirt, because because of the fires, there's so much dirt in the air that I can't even see the ocean. How is that? It's like 50 feet away.
Right.
I feel like I'm driving around in Beijing.
I know what you mean. There is that general haze, and we know that there is this particulate matter in the air. And we also know that everything travels on the jet stream. So China's pollution is our pollution. And
our pollution is their pollution. And there's a lot here after these fires on the coast.
Absolutely.
And we're not getting that rainfall because the soil and the trees and the mushrooms that release those bacteria that create those raindrops to fall. Instead, we're getting more winds. And so every time we get these huge winds, I just think that probably could have been rain.
Yeah.
But when you don't have that to call that precipitation down, it moves to a cooler area and it creates the windstorm.
Okay.
And that is created by the bare soil. And our Santa Anas begin in Utah. What does Utah look like?
Yeah.
But we're creating our own winds here now too.
Linda, thank you so much for sharing this wisdom. We always just barely scrape the surface. We're like the very first few inches of the soil ourselves here. We know there's very, very much deeper roots here. But in any case, could you share with listeners how they can stay in contact with you? I know you're running a Zoom Q&A around the soil weekly, and where should they reach you?
Yeah. So one of the things that has happened is a lot of my friends and friends of friends send me emails and ask me questions. And it took a lot of time. So I decided to, since in this COVID time, to hold free Zooms every Tuesday at 7:30. And if you go to woodshedgardens.com, there's a link on there that you can click on and join us on 7:30. This coming up Tuesday, I've had to cancel because I'm involved with a safe tech webinar that I don't want it to conflict with. So, but other than that, every Tuesday at 7:30.
And give your links again so that we can find the links. Your
Woodshed Gardens.
Plural.
.com. Yeah, plural. Gardens.com. And on there, Under events, there is a link
And
to
they
the
can reach out
Tuesday
to
night.
in any case, or woodshedgardens.com, and also Linda Gibbs on Facebook, correct? They can reach out to you either way.
Yeah, not really on Facebook. I have one there, but
Okay.
if you write to me, I probably won't answer, but you can send me an email through my website.
Okay, woodshedgardens.com. Listeners, do get educated around soil and succession every way you can.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Linda. We're so grateful to have had you on the show today.
Well done, Carrie Kim. You're doing the good work.
Doing it together.
Bye.
Thank you to our guest today, Linda Gibbs, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been Ecological Succession, moving toward regeneration. Please connect with us on social media at EcoJustice Radio and SoCal350. If you like what you heard and you want others to be informed, subscribe to our podcast, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by donating to the show at ecojusticeradio.org. You have been listening to EcoJustice Radio, a project of SoCal 350. The show can be found on all major podcast apps and at ecojusticeradio.org. Created by Mark and JP Morris, executive producer Jack Ite, engineer Blake Lampkin, interview hosted by Carrie Kim, and original music by Javier Cadre. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.